Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Leibowitz. I have been interested in the Federal Reserve ever since I read Milton Friedman's book, Free to Choose, back in 1999. And here today to talk to us about it is someone well qualified to do so. He is a senior fellow at the Mises Institute, and he was previously the principal deputy director of the Office of Financial Research in the United States Treasury Department. Alex J. Pollock, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. Great to be with you.
Well, I guess for starters, I should ask, what exactly is the Federal Reserve?
That is a great question. And one of the things it is a wonderful mystique, which fascinates people, with the idea that somehow there's this committee of people who are going to, quote, manage the economy, unquote, something that no one can do. And this committee can't do it either. Another thing the Federal Reserve is actually a bank. It is itself a bank. Really, it's 12 banks. There are 12 Federal Reserve banks, and they have districts all across the country, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and so on, going out to San Francisco. And they, like other banks, they have assets and liabilities and loans and investments and deposits, and they have a profit or loss as well. They have one special thing in which they have a monopoly, and that is the issuance of paper currency. So these 12 banks operating together as the Federal Reserve put out the dollar bills that we and many other people around the world carry in their wallets. And that by nature doesn't have to be a government monopoly, but it is. It didn't used to be, say, in the 19th century in this country. But that is a tremendously valuable monopoly to have, to be the issuer of paper currency, because it gives them a funding source, namely this paper currency, which has no interest, and they can then invest that in interest-bearing investments. That is, they give you some paper money and you give them a treasury bill, and the treasury bill pays interest. So that's one thing. Now, another thing the Fed is a manipulator of interest rates and of the amount of money, because once we left any tie to gold in the monetary system, which happened in 1971, actually August 1971, a really important date in financial history.
Hold on one second. Hold on.
Yeah.
Now, it gets complicated, though, right? Because didn't FDR take us off the gold standard?
I'm sorry?
Didn't FDR take us off the gold standard?
There are two stages in the leaving of gold. First, in the 1930s, under Franklin Roosevelt, but there was still a link to gold after Roosevelt took us off gold. He not only took the United States off gold, he confiscated the gold of American citizens and gave them much less valuable paper currency in exchange. A really amazing act of despotism, in fact. And the Congress of those days, unbelievably, made it illegal for American citizens to own gold. And that lasted for 40 years, until the 1970s. So when I was a trainee in banking, it was illegal for me to own any gold coins. Well, that's an astonishingly despotic act by a government. So that was the first stage. But as the development of the global financial system continued, there was still in international monetary arrangements, which were actually a contract called Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods was negotiated in 1944. The chief American negotiator at Bretton Woods was a man named Harry Dexter White, who was a senior official of the U.S. Treasury. Turned out he was also a Russian spy. They found that out later. But he said, the U.S. dollar and gold are synonymous. That's what he thought in 1944. So the system was set up so that American citizens couldn't own gold, but that foreign countries, foreign central banks and governments could turn in their dollars for gold at a fixed price of $35 an ounce. So there was this ongoing link to gold in the international system, not the domestic economy. And that lasted till 1971, when foreign governments started taking us up on the promise to redeem gold, and we were running out. There was a young man at the time in the US Treasury named Paul Volcker, before he became famous. And he used to keep a chart and report to the president, who was Richard Nixon, through the Secretary of the Treasury, how the gold stock was going down and down, and they could see they were going to run out. So that gives you a choice. You can either devalue, which they could have done in 1971, or you could just say, well, by the way, we're not paying, which is what they did do. So that was the 71. All right, once that happened, this is really important, because once that happened, there is no limit to the amount of money that the Federal Reserve can print up. No limit. There's only the limit that if they print too much, then inflation really gets away, and then there's a political pressure to do something. But in terms of the structure of the central bank, they can print any amount. And this is really important. And this is in the hands of a group called the Federal Open Market Committee. They're meeting today to manipulate interest rates, maybe, or to make some decision. And they are composed of all of the members of the Federal Reserve Board, who are called governors, and 5 of the 12 Federal Reserve Bank presidents. And they try to say, all right, well, we're going to set interest rates and the amount of money and the size of the Federal Reserve balance sheet to get some kind of good outcome. Well, of course, they don't really know what they're doing, because they can't know what they're doing. And it's not because they're not smart. They're all smart and they're well educated. They have fine degrees, but no one can know what the path of a complex free market economy is going to be. And they can't either. So they'll get together today and make some kind of guess, and we'll see.
Now, is the Federal Reserve a public organization, meaning is it government or is it private? Because these banks are privately owned. Would it best be described maybe as quasi-governmental?
Yes, I think that's a fair description. The stock of the Federal Reserve Bank is all owned by private banks. So the commercial banks, all national banks, nationally chartered banks, by law must be members. They say members of the Fed and buy stock in the Fed. Banks which are chartered by individual states may become members of the Fed, and those members buy stock. So there's about $36 billion of paid-in capital in the 12 Federal Reserve banks altogether, and that's all owned by private banks. It's probably not the case that they own the Federal Reserve Bank. They own the stock, but they can't act as an owner of the Federal Reserve Bank. It's controlled by itself, actually, and amazing, with some accountability to Congress. So that's the stock. But the Federal Reserve as a whole is without question part of the government. There is a great discussion about whether the Federal Reserve is independent or should be independent. That's nonsense. It's not independent. It's caught up in the political discussions in Washington, and it always has to be aware of the political winds that are blowing, as well as the financial and economic winds in which it's trying to set the sails as they see it. In the 1950s, they used to say, and I think it's quite true, the Federal Reserve is independent within the government. Independent. Well, what do you think that means? It means that they're not really independent, but they're sort of independent, and they are part of the government, but they do have this private aspect to them. through the stock ownership. And those stockholders do elect 2/3 of the directors of the Federal Reserve banks, of the 12 banks. So the 12 banks you could almost think of as a government-sponsored enterprise, sort of like Fannie Mae as originally thought of. But the Federal Reserve Board, which is officially called the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, is a purely governmental operation. Its directors or its governors appointed by the president with advice and consent of the Senate. And that's the Washington Board. Now, what's happened in the history of the Federal Reserve, which was the Federal Reserve Act was 1913. So it's been 110 years this year. And during that 110 years, what's happened is the power was originally designed by the authors of the Federal Reserve Act to be dispersed among the 12 banks.
Well, hold on one second. I want to ask you, this is actually where I was going next.
You hold me and ask me anytime.
Yeah. What was the original purpose of the Federal Reserve? In other words, what was the reasoning that they created it? And how has that changed over time? I mean, I know the power has increased dramatically, but in what ways from its original
power? Thank you. This is very true. And by the way, let me recommend a book here written by an old friend of mine. His name is Bernard Shull, Shull. It's called The Fourth Estate. It's the history of the Fed. And it's about the unlikely, what he calls the unlikely rise to power and prominence of the Federal Reserve. The fourth is, I'm sorry, must be the fourth branch. The fourth, not the fourth estate, the fourth branch, Bernard Shull. And he relates in here, two things are happening. The Federal Reserve is getting more and more power. He wrote this book about 20 years ago, but over the 100 years, let's say. But also that power is becoming more and more centralized, more and more concentrated in Washington. It's the Federal Reserve because 110 years ago, the authors of the act wanted to have a federal structure, like states and national. So they didn't set up one central bank. They set up this, what they thought of as a federal system. But the power within the Federal Reserve has gotten more and more concentrated in Washington, and it always had a concentration in New York, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. But the power moved from all the banks, including New York, into Washington. So that's one thing that's been happening. The power is getting more and more centralized, and the power is getting greater and greater. And in this book, Bernard Shull proposes what I called in his honor Shull's paradox, which is the more blunders the Federal Reserve makes, the more powerful it gets. And that's true. I think it's a very good summary of the history.
That's true of government in general.
Yes. It's funny. And of course, the other thing, well, I want to come back to your question on why the Federal Reserve was set up. It was fundamentally set up to be able to finance crises. So a system of borrowing short and lending long, which a banking system is inherently unstable from time to time. And when you get in trouble, they had just had a big panic in 1907, the famous panic of 1907. They studied it intensely. There were various proposals of what to do about it. What they finally, and then there had been many other panics before that. Of course, we've had a lot of panics since then too. We just had a small panic this spring that took three large banks down, and we had a giant panic in 2020 after when the COVID crisis, when the health crisis turned into a financial crisis. Our new book is about that. But anyway. They wanted to have a system where you could expand money in times of a panic. That's really the fundamental purpose of the Federal Reserve. And if you read the Federal Reserve Act, the preface starts off is to create Federal Reserve banks so that it doesn't say exactly this, but so that we can have an elastic currency. That's what they called it at the time, an elastic currency, which meant that you would create this thing so that in times of trouble, you could expand money to get through the crisis. And that actually isn't a bad idea. The problem is that when the crisis is over, they don't stop expanding. And we see that again now. I call that the Cincinnatian problem, because Cincinnatus, or Cincinnatus, was a Roman hero who, as the legend had it, was called from the plow to save the state. He left his farm. He took over command of the army. He was made temporary dictator of Rome. He drove off the barbarians and saved Rome, and then he resigned and went back to his farm. Okay, that's what the Fed never does. Doesn't resign and go back to his farm. And it's probably not as talented as Cincinnatus apparently was, at least in legend. So the problem is, how do you turn off this emergency behavior when it's over? Okay, that's one thing. The second thing is that the whole business of so-called managing the economy and controlling inflation, or as they now have said, aiming for perpetual inflation at 2%. Of course, it gets away from time to time because of their own behavior. All that was made up later. All that was made up later in the evolution, in this expansion of the Federal Reserve, in making numerous blunders over the years, and every time they make either inflationary or deflationary blunders, by some strange political magic, becoming even more powerful and even more prestigious than they were before. It's really a fascinating study, and I think very, very little understood, but essential to the modern state. Actually, to modern states going back, let's say, at least to the founding of the Bank of England, which was 1694. So you get this sort of cooperation of the central bank within the government, there to finance a crisis from time to time, but also to do something else, which we have to mention, which is finance the government itself. The real reason governments love central banks is, well, when you need some money and you're running deficits, what are you going to do? How about issuing some bonds to your own central bank, which prints up some money to buy your bonds, and therefore finances the government, and therefore allows the government to run deficits, to spend money, to buy votes, to become more powerful, to expand itself. So the central bank ability to create money to finance the government is really essential to the expansion of government power. And this must be understood.
There's so many questions I want to ask, but first, you mentioned that it's not a bad idea to have this elastic currency, this organization that can inject money into the economy during times of crisis. But isn't it impossible for them to know how much money is necessary to put into the economy? I mean, the market operates with lightning-like rapidity. And by the time they get together and make their decisions, the dynamics within the market have already likely changed. Well, not likely, necessarily would have changed. And then they put the money in. And if the economy is already recovering and they put the money in, they're just going to lead to inflation. And if the economy's worse off than what they thought, it's not going to be enough money. And it just seems like it's inevitable that they're not going to be able to handle this. Whereas a gold standard, which, I mean, you can always, if there's an abundance of production, but then if you have a gold standard, then prices will just drop. But the dollar will be worth so much more. So it doesn't really matter if the prices are dropping, if you're getting more for your dollar. So really, is it a good idea especially given the propensity of human beings to abuse power and government in particular. So that I just wanted to challenge you a little bit on that it's a good idea. I mean, to say it's a good idea, it's like a mental exercise, right? To say, oh, this sounds like a good idea, but in reality, it can never work, right? Am I wrong on this? Am I way off?
Well, you're right about one thing, and that is they can't ever really know what's going to happen. A problem uh, with being the Federal Reserve is that you can't know what the results of your own actions are going to be. And that's also true in crises. And it's even more true if you're not in a crisis, like right now. Although we'll see whether the stresses on the financial system will create. Well, they certainly will in time, because on average, I should tell you, on average throughout long history, I mean centuries, financial crises occur about once every 10 years. And that's also true in my own life. Now, but it's certainly true you can't know for sure, and you can't ever know. And one of the reasons you can't is precisely what you said, which is the market is adapting all the time to whatever you do. In fact, the market is adapting to its expectations of what you're going to do. So I tell this little joke. Well, this isn't a joke, actually. I tell this little story. And it's right now, we have everybody is speculating what will the Fed do, and prices are moving around and decisions are being made based on guesses about that. And here's the story. What is it like to be the Federal Reserve trying to set monetary policy? Well, it's like being in the cockpit trying to land a 747 jet, only your windshield is painted over. You can't actually see anything. And you're flying on your instruments. And the instruments are telling you where you were 15 minutes ago, not where you are now. And on top of that, in the real analogy, the airport is watching your moves and reacting to it and moving itself around as you're trying to land in it. Well, it's a pretty tough problem. Nonetheless, my study of financial history, which I've done a lot of, leads me to believe that there are two things that the central bank actually can do well, and one of them is helping get through a crisis. Now, what it doesn't do well, as I said a minute ago, and you just also said, is it doesn't get out of whatever it's doing. I mean, look at right now. The Federal Reserve owns $2.5 trillion of mortgage securities today. They have a mark-to-market loss on those securities of hundreds of billions of dollars. Do they know what they're doing with those mortgages? No. How many mortgages should they own? They should own zero. They should go back to owning zero. Was it okay to buy some mortgages at the height of the crisis in 2008, 9, 10? I guess as a purely temporary matter, I probably could be talked into that. But you had to get out, but they don't get out. So that's one. The second, but the calming the crisis, and you had crises under the gold standard. The great intellectual father of using the central bank in his day, the Bank of England. They remember the Bank of England was the top bank in the world. The world currency was the British pound, not the US dollar, until the First World War. And when Bagehot's day, which he's writing in the 1860s and 1870s, and arguing the Bank of England had to step in and finance the crisis and then get out. But that was all done under the gold standard, and it was assumed that the gold standard would apply under Bagehot's organ. Bagehot is the intellectual godfather of all this. Okay, so one thing, in my view, the Fed can do is it can help finance the crisis. It's terrible at getting out. It doesn't know how to manage the economy in normal times. The other thing they can do, and they're very successful at, unfortunately, is financing the government, letting the government expand with endless debt by financing the government itself. So the Fed now owns over 5 trillion. I mean, it's dollars of government bonds. Well, that's, you know, Treasury sends some bonds to the Fed, and the Fed prints up the money to buy them. And they actually, they succeed at that, unfortunately, because it lets the government get ever bigger, ever more powerful, and ever more intrusive, which is why you'll always have central banks, because they're so useful to the governments in doing this. So if you really want to have, as I do and you do, a limited government, you really have to do something about controlling the central banks.
You
How do
said,
we do that?
well, that's a good question. You mentioned a moment ago that we had crises under the gold standard, but have we ever had a pure gold standard, especially one wherein it was known by banks that the government would not bail them out? Because if a bank knows that a government's going to bail them out, the perverse incentive is they're going to take risks they otherwise don't risk. They're going to expand credit beyond their limit. And then you're going to end up with the crises that Mises and Hayek described so well. So couldn't it be argued that we've never actually had a pure gold standard in a pure market economy?
Well, I think you had a gold standard, but you had a gold standard buttressed every 10 years or so with government interventions, with panic interventions. Now, the argument you make is very powerful and classic. By the way, it was first made in 1802 by Henry Thornton in a classic book called An Inquiry into the Paper Credit of Great Britain. And he said, if the private bankers and private actors know that the central bank and the government will always rush to bail them out, they'll become riskier and they'll bring on the crisis that you're trying to avoid. And I think that's quite true. It's a fundamental dilemma in the nature of financial systems. But financial systems, in my opinion, because they are fundamentally uncertain, and therefore they're always surprising us, however smart we may think we are, make mistakes. It's not only that they may have bad incentives, that's true, but they make mistakes. And as I look at my own life, which has included a number of years of being a CEO of things, and of discussing things like this, and I think of how many mistakes I've made, why it's truly humbling. And financial markets regularly make mistakes, and they turn out to be giant mistakes. So you have this dilemma. What are you going to do? And there's no doubt about the fact, precisely as you say, that the more you make it clear that every time you make a mistake, you'll be bailed out, the more likely you are to make mistakes. And it's fundamental problem. The more certain you are that the government will never make you pay back your student loan, the more you'll borrow.
Of course, why not, right?
And absolutely. And if you're a college and you're getting the money from the student loan and you have nothing at risk, why? The more student loans you'll push on your students, and you'll use the money to buy all kinds of useless deans of equity or something or other, and expand your bureaucracy and make your college less productive because you've got all this money. It's a great example of in a specific area of just what you're talking about. And it's a fundamental. I mean, you have these. In my youth, I studied philosophy, and one of the things I learned, and I can't remember the author, but there was this marvelous essay that I studied, pretty sure as a sophomore, and it was called Fundamentally Contestable Propositions. And these are propositions that are so difficult and there are always propositions about human behavior and human behavior in crowds, which is what a financial market is. That are, he called, fundamentally contestable and won't ever be settled. and how to find the perfect point between not setting up terrible incentives for financial markets to make mistakes and covering the mistakes when they happen anyway, no matter how smart people may be. That's one of these fundamentally contestable propositions, which you have put your finger on perfectly.
So what led me to contact you to get you on the show? I read an article that you wrote about the Fed bleeding red ink, that it's losing money. So what does that mean, that the Federal Reserve is losing money?
Yeah,
and why is it losing money?
Right. First of all, it's losing a lot of money. That article I wrote when I was reading the June 30th official financial statements of the Federal Reserve. Most people don't even know these statements exist, but the Federal Reserve must publish financial statements like anybody else, but they do it rather quietly, and so that's why I wrote that article. And at that point, the aggregate losses of the Fed up to June 30th, excuse me, were $57 billion. $57 billion. Well, that's a lot of money, to be sure. Well, since then, it is now the middle of September, their losses have reached $100 billion. Last week, the Federal Reserve published statements, and hardly anybody knows these exist, or if they know it, they don't know how to read them, because the Fed is very sneaky in how it reports this. But there is a weekly Federal Reserve report called the Federal Reserve H, capital H, .4.1 report. You should look at it if you never have. It's the financial statements of the Federal Reserve weekly. And last week, if you know how to read these statements, you would have discovered that the aggregate losses of the Federal Reserve have reached and passed $100 billion. Now you think about this. Think about $100 billion. How do these guys, who think they're smart enough to, quote, manage the economy and tell us what interest rates should be, by the way, which no one can know what an interest rate should be. That's why you have a market, because no one can know. But anyway, they think they know, or they think they should know. And how can it be, if you're smart enough to do that, you're running a bank or a system of 12 banks, which has now lost $100 billion. I think it's something worth pondering. How did they lose? Well, that's just what they've lost so far. Their losses are continuing at the rate of about $9.5 billion a month, and they will, without question, continue on into next year. I've been trying to see what they will add up to by the end. Of course, it depends on a lot of factors. I don't know what they will be, but I guess the losses will certainly exceed $200 billion, at least. We know what the mark-to-market of the Federal Reserve balance sheet is. That you can read in the footnotes of their little-known financial statements, if you read the footnotes like I do. And
riveting reading, I'll bet.
It is actually, if you're
exciting. Real page turner.
Well, it is actually, if you're interested in these issues. So if you can get far enough back in the footnotes to find the mark-to-market of the Federal Reserve, what do you think their mark-to-market loss is or was on June 30th, which are the latest numbers we have?
70 billion.
You're low. $1 trillion. $1 trillion.
Oh my Lord.
$1 trillion. So, well, okay, so what did they do? Well, back in 2008, they started buying as an emergency measure. mortgage-backed securities. That means 30-year loans. That means they're buying the securitized form of assets which had fixed rates for 30 years. Well, no one knows what's going to happen in 30 years. I mean, we don't even know what's going to happen in 30 days, let alone 30 years. They started buying very long treasury bonds. They bought up to 30-year treasuries. In the current portfolio of the Federal Reserve is a treasury bond which has a yield of 1.25%, and it doesn't mature until 2050. They're going to be sitting, if they hold on to it, they're going to be sitting on that for almost 30 more years. All right, then Fed Chairman Bernanke, an extremely intelligent man, went to the Congress and said, "This is a temporary program. We're going to do this for a temporary measure, and then we're going to correct everything, and we're going to go back to normal." Guess what? Didn't happen. I mean, the correction didn't happen. So they kept on buying. And then along came the panic in 2020, and they bought more, and they continued on into 2021. They set off a gigantic bubble market in stocks and in bonds and in cryptocurrencies and in houses, real estate generally, by doing this. And they built their balance sheet up to $8.9 trillion. And how did they do it? They bought all these very long-term fixed rate securities. All right. On which today the market value is $1 trillion less than the price they paid for it. So you might say it wasn't, now you can have a discussion. Was that a really skillful financial move? Was that somehow worth it in some macroeconomic theory? Anyway, now short-term interest rates are over 5%. What do you think the yield? So they've got this portfolio. It's about $7.5 trillion. Think how big $7.5 trillion is. About $7.5 trillion of these very long-term mortgages and bonds that they bought. What do you think the average interest rate they're receiving on those bonds is?
I think you said it's 2%.
2%. Thank you for reading my stuff.
Yeah, I'm no genius. I just read your article.
Well, you're a genius if you choose to read my stuff.
Okay, fair enough.
2%. 2%. So they're making 2%. Now, if you have those on your balance sheet, you're a bank. The Federal Reserve is highly leveraged, means they have all these deposits and debt. What do they have to pay to fund these 2%, $7.5 trillion of mortgages? Well, for most of it, they have to pay basically 5.5%. Actually, it's averaging about 5.37 or so percent at the moment. So well over 5%. So this is the line you may remember from that piece. So do you have to be a PhD in economics or a highly trained Wall Street analyst to figure out that if you're investing at 2% and borrowing at 5%, the outcome may not be pretty?
No, it doesn't sound like it.
That's your Federal Reserve today. So far, in the last 12 months, they've lost $100 billion. By the end of 2024, maybe they'll lose another 100 billion. And what does that money do? What does that mean? That means taxpayer money. That's your government having, for its own book, created a gigantic speculation on interest rates, buying very long and borrowing very short, and losing so far $100 billion. Well, that's money that the Treasury has lost. The Fed has lost it, but the Fed is part of the government. The government has lost it. It means the deficit is $100 billion bigger. It means the national debt is $100 billion bigger. It means they've lost $100 billion of taxpayer money. Well, you might say that's taxing the public without any legislation I think that would be a fair way to characterize it, actually. So it's not only calls into question, let's say, the financial expertise behind these acts, the question of having promised it would be temporary and corrected, it wasn't, and then we expanded again. But uh, it is costing the Treasury and therefore the taxpayers this much money, and it's going to keep on costing it. So I think it's a very serious issue to think about, and it really that brings me back to, well, how can this Fed, which thinks it wants to be independent, but in a democratic republic, a constitutional republic, you can't have pieces of the government which are just independent on their own, running around doing whatever they want, creating inflation, spending, losing $100 billion, wrecking the purchasing power of the people's money. That's a ridiculous idea. They have to be embedded in a system of checks and balances in the government. I think that's something that seriously we have to work on.
Do you think that we today need a Federal Reserve? I mean, former Congressman Ron Paul wrote a book, "End the Fed."
Yeah.
I just, it doesn't seem to me like you've got this organization that's in charge of managing large parts of the economy, the fundamental parts, the financial sector, and yet they can't even make investments that are proving profitable for themselves. And from my understanding, they cause these crises, then they make them worse. And inflation itself, I've heard called a tax, and it is. I mean, your prices that
Oh, yes,
you're paying
for
for
sure.
goods go up.
Inflation is a tax.
Yeah. So
For sure.
can we get rid of this? I mean, I'm not. I don't mean can we
No,
get rid of it in the sense of can we vote it out. I'm saying could we get rid of it and the economy still survives in free economy in money, for instance, or free banking.
I think we need to, of course, you are creating, once again, a classic discussion in finance. I think we have to move, realistically, you have to move toward a sounder money, which means withdrawing a lot of the manipulation that the Federal Reserve makes. I don't think the world of no central bank. I mean, the world is full of central banks. Didn't used to be, I mean, and one of my good friends who studied this a lot says, actually, if you didn't have the central bank, you would just the Treasury could do everything on its own that the central bank does, and the Treasury could certainly issue currency. Treasury used to issue currency. Greenback was the paper currency issued by the United States Treasury. There was no Federal Reserve to finance the Union armies, to suppress the rebellion, as they said in those days, of the Civil War. The Treasury could do anything in the way of expanding money if it was not under a gold standard. So if you still had a Treasury, you could still get all of this interference. Then you have to ask yourself, well, is there an advantage in potential control of the monetary powers by having a separate organization? Well, there could be. I mean, it's a case you could make that. Alexander Hamilton thought you should have that. He's on the opposite side of Ron Paul here. In his proposal to create a bank in the United States, which he thought should have private shareholders. Hamilton did, because he said, well, if you have private shareholders, they'll help control the activities of the bank. Well, we have private shareholders, but they don't control the activities of the Fed. To me, the question is, how do we move into a more controlled governmental operation in the operation of money? That, as we discussed before, I think to have elastic currency in the panic on balance is a good idea, although it has the problems we discussed. But in general, we should be moving, and the public would benefit, and the people would benefit to a sound money system where you don't have, through the device of the central bank, taxation, through inflation, taxation, through the central bank losing money. This is really unprecedented, by the way. Fed always made money. They lost a little in 1915 because they were in startup mode, but since then they always made money, and they're supposed to automatically make money. Now they're losing money. Well, all this should bring you to the point that there needs to be more control and rethought this power that the Federal Reserve represents. And it's a hard project to move forward on because it's so advantageous to the government to be able to have its spending financed by this so-called independent central bank.
Quite the dilemma we've got ourselves
in.
in.
Yeah, it is. It's very fascinating. It's very little understood and surrounded by tremendous mystique. I mean, if you read about the Fed, I'll tell you, one of my friends is a very prominent economist, an extremely good one and very smart. I was talking to him one day, some years ago, and I said, well, now, if you look at the balance sheet of the Fed, and he said, what do you mean the balance sheet of the Fed? I said, well, you know, their balance sheet like anybody else. He said, really? He didn't know the Federal Reserve had a balance sheet. So there's this kind of mystique about the Fed, which should always make us think of that famous scene in The Wizard of Oz, when the wizard says, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Yeah. That's the Fed.
Yes, it is. Well, I thank you so much for coming on and explaining it to us a little bit anyway. Give us a heads up. There's mountains of information out there about the Fed. It's like you said, it's shrouded in mystique. Well, where can the audience find you? If they want to read your papers, where can they go?
Thank you. Well, you can look at my website, which has all my articles and essays. It's alexjpollock.com. ALEXJPOLLOCK.com will get you to everything I write. You could also, if you wanted to, get my books. I have 3 books. One is called Boom and Bust, which is a history of these cycles we've been talking about. One is called Finance and Philosophy, Why We're Always Surprised, about the fundamental uncertainty of financial markets, which so plagues the poor members of the Open Market Committee. And the last one, having written Why We're Always Surprised, then after 2020, with my great co-author, Howard Adler, we wrote a book called Surprised Again. Surprised Again. So you might be interested in looking at those.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very, very much for being with us today. For now, this is the Rational Egoist. I'm Michael Leibowitz signing out. Remember, let me know what you think. Ask any questions you'd like. Till next time.